देती हमें आजादी बिना खड्ग बिना ढाल, साबरमती के संत तूने कर दिया कमाल। देती हमें आजादी बिना खड्ग बिना ढाल, साबरमती के संत तूने कर दिया कमाल। आंधी में भी जलती रही गांधी तेरी मशाल, साबरमती के संत तूने कर दिया कमाल।
Thank you, Professor Thakkar. Thank you, Yogesh Bhai. Thank you all for coming here. For any scholar of Gandhi, Mani Bhavan is I won't say sacred place, but place of great importance. And for me as well, and for an intensely personal reason. The person who changed my life was a remarkable, now largely forgotten British eccentric scholar called Verrier Elwin, who was educated at Oxford, got 2 first-class degrees, was ordained as a priest, and came to India to join a small Christian ashram in Pune that was trying to indigenize Christianity. This was in September 1927. And Elwin met the Mahatma about a year later and instantly was charmed by him, became a disciple. Later on went to work among Adivasis, became the foremost expert of the Adivasis of central India. Much later was the first foreigner to be granted Indian citizenship and wrote a series of influential and important books. And he changed my life because till I read Elwin, I was an indifferent student of economics. I often say that I was in that rare category of getting a second class throughout my academic career. There's a certain distinction in getting a first class, and dare I say it, a certain distinction in getting a third class as well. But I was resolutely in the middle, till I read Elwin, and I realized that economics was not for me. There was perhaps a future outside, and I moved to sociology and anthropology. And Elwin had a very interesting and complicated relationship with Gandhi. He was first a disciple, then he became a rebel, then again he was reconciled. I mean, they had their disagreements on such things as alcohol and sex and so on. But one of the most moving descriptions in Elwin's compellingly readable autobiography is of his being on the terrace upstairs in January 1932 when Gandhi was arrested. One of the many times Gandhi was arrested, but Gandhi was sleeping out in the open, as he liked to do. And Elwin was there at the time when the police commissioner came, not Mr. Sani, one of Mr. Sani's predecessors, came and arrested him. So Mani Bhavan, I read about Mani Bhavan in Elwin's autobiography when I was a college student, and I've been back here several times, sometimes on personal visits, once for a meeting connected with Gandhian heritage sites. So it's really for me, it's not so much a academic obligation as a personal, a question of personal attachment, affection, sentimentality. Of course, I'm a scholar of Gandhi. I've spent the last several years writing a book on Gandhi. I'll spend the rest of my life, I think, working on Gandhi. And that connection is there. But there's also this personal connection, that it was Elwin who, in a sense, gave me her second life. From being a failed economist, and I should also add, I was also a failed cricketer. I was a second-class cricketer as well as a second-class economist. And at the age of 21, it was Elwin who gave me a new news of life, allowed me to do a PhD in sociology, become a writer, work on Gandhi, and of course the Elwin-Gandhi connection is right here, in the terrace where Gandhi was arrested, with Elwin by his side in January 1932. I've called my talk Gandhi and India in 1915. As Usha Ben mentioned, and as all of you know, since it's been reported widely in the papers, this is the very week 100 years ago that Gandhi returned to India for good in January 1915. And I've called my talk Gandhi and India. Okay. That'll do? So he came back here 100 years ago, and what was he like? So I'll start with what Gandhi was like in 1915, and then move on to what India was like in 1915. Some of what I'm going to say, the first half of my lecture, has been covered in my book, Gandhi Before India. So those of you who've read the book, apologies if it's tiresomely familiar terrain, but I think that it's important to rehearse what Gandhi was like when he landed in Mumbai on the 9th of January 1915. Well, he was in his mid-40s, so he'd already lived more than half his life, and he was coming back to his homeland to make a career whose own directions he did not really know. I mean, I've called my talk Waiting for the Mahatma, but the Mahatma was waiting for himself in a certain sense. Though, of course, he'd been prepared for it by his many years in the diaspora, especially in South Africa. To refresh our memory, Gandhi was born in 1869 in the town of Porbandar. As a young boy, he moved to Rajkot with his father, who became Diwan of Rajkot after having been Diwan of Porbandar. His early years were spent in princely India, not in the two-thirds of India controlled by the British. This was to have an important impact on his later way of thinking. And among the first influences on him was his mother, particularly her religious thought. I mean, she was deeply pious, and there's a wonderful description in Gandhi's autobiography of his mother fasting and not breaking the fast till the moon had been sighted in the evening. She was pious, but she also was somewhat heterodox. They were a family of orthodox Banyas, scrupulously vegetarian, like Banyas tend to be, but the mother was somewhat of a deviant in that she was a devotee of a sect known as the Pranamis, whose founder, it was said, had visited Mecca. And whether this is true or not, we can't say. But in the shrines of the Pranamis, there were verses from the Quran in Arabic and verses from the Gita in Sanskrit side by side. And there were no idols. And this, I think, this early exposure to a syncretic tradition of Hinduism left its mark on Gandhi. He was deeply attached to his mother. The father was distant, as Indian fathers tended to be in those times. But the father was to play a consequential role in Gandhi's life by dying when Gandhi was young. Now, those of you who have read his autobiography know that Gandhi traces his obsession with brahmacharya or celibacy or the control of one's passions to the night his father died, because as he relates in his autobiography, he was making love to his wife Kasturba, and the attendant said, "Your father is sick," and he was consumed by passion, did not go to attend the father, and the father died. Now, you know that. But from a historian's point of view, the more important fact of his father's dying was that it gave Gandhi room to go to England. Shortly after his father died, Gandhi decided, he graduated from high school 2 years later and enrolled resultantly in a college in Bhavnagar, and he decided that he would wanted to go to England and become a lawyer. And had his father been alive, it is almost certain that he would have been disallowed from doing so, because his father was orthodox. His uncle Tulsi Das, whom he consulted, said, if you go to England, British barristers wear suits, they consume whiskey, they forget their traditions, and the father would have been even more suspicious about sending his son far away. So the death of his father, in a curious way, freed Gandhi to go abroad. And London, I argue in my book, in Gandhi Before India, was absolutely crucial in the making of the man, the philosopher, the social activist, the maker of history. It was in London that Gandhi made his first foreign friends. It was in London that Gandhi understood the difference between different religious faiths. It was in London that Gandhi became a writer. There are more than 90 volumes of Gandhi's collected works. And those volumes start with a series that Gandhi wrote for the Journal of the Vegetarian Society of London. Now, I think that his intensive interactions with the vegetarians in London has been underappreciated. In my view, they were absolutely fundamental. I mean, the vegetarians are an obscure sect. E.M.S. Namboodiripad, the distinguished Indian communist thinker, several times Chief Minister of Kerala, the author of many books, one of which is a short book called The Mahatma and the Ism, which is a series of reviews written on the the volumes of biography that D.G. Tendulkar was writing on Gandhi in the 1950s. And in the chapter on London, E.M.S. Namboodiripad says, Gandhi goes to London in 1888. Karl Marx had died, but Engels was alive. The Labour Party had been born. Everyone was discussing Darwin and the ideas of evolution. And what does Gandhi do? He joins the Vegetarian Society of London. Now, this puzzled the Marxists a great deal, with kind of condescension. That here, it's a time of so much intellectual and ideological and political ferment. For other people, late 1880s, for people with more artistic or creative instincts, was also a fantastic time. George Bernard Shaw was writing his first plays. W.G. Grace was batting at Lord's. But Gandhi didn't go to the theatre or to watch cricket either. He went and joined the Vegetarian Society of London. And I don't think this was simply eccentric. I think this was transformative. For it was with the Vegetarians of London that Gandhi learnt the value of organization, of activism, of campaigning, to work in a group, to have an idea, to pursue it, to go and persuade other people, to use not just speech but the pen. Gandhi honed his skills as a writer, as I said, in the Journal of the Vegetarian Society of London. And he also learned how to befriend people of other races and religious faiths. In his childhood, he had this famous or notorious Muslim friend whom he writes about in his autobiography called Sheikh Mehtab. First introduced him to the pleasures of eating flesh and so on, and took him to a brothel and Sheikh Mehtab was actually quite an interesting fellow. Gandhi does not do him justice because, as I show in my book, Gandhi Before India, although he was a noxious influence on Gandhi as a schoolboy, later on he joined Gandhi's movement in South Africa and also wrote some stirring Gujarati poems about the movement. Anyway, so he had a Muslim friend in Sheikh Mehtab. There was the odd Parsi boy in his class in Rajkot. The headmaster was a Parsi. But they were all Gujarati speaking. It's in England that he makes his first English friends, his first Christian friends. And foremost among them was a man called Josiah Oldfield, who was a doctor, a fellow member of the Vegetarian Society, with whom Gandhi shared a home. Now, in the 1880s, for a white man and a brown man to share a home in London was a pretty revolutionary thing to do. So here is Gandhi already breaching the boundaries of caste, of convention, going beyond what his background and his upbringing and his family tradition expected him to be, making new friends, learning new ways of interacting in the world, and becoming an activist, finding a cause. And I think his years with the Vegetarian Society are, as I said, massively underappreciated. I think they were to contribute in more ways than we perhaps recognize now to the mature political activist that Gandhi became. So anyway, Gandhi, in the midst of all this vegetarianism and activism, passes his law exams, is enrolled as a barrister, comes back to India in August 1891, and tries but fails to set himself up as a barrister in Bombay and in Rajkot. He's a failed lawyer who fails both in his hometown of Rajkot and in Bombay, which was really the center of the legal profession. And he is rescued from oblivion and professional failure by an invitation from South Africa. Now, here again, there are things Gandhi tells you in his autobiography, and there are things he does not tell you. And it's the job of a biographer to really pry into the kinds of things that Gandhi does not, that your subject does not tell you. And one of the things that Gandhi does not tell you is an incident that occurred in his hometown or his place of birth, Porbandar, when he returns from England in 1892. Gandhi merely says in his autobiography that my brother Lakshmi Das had got into some trouble and he had asked me to speak to the resident in Porbandar, and I went to plead with the resident on my brother's behalf, and the resident, who was an Englishman called Colonel Oliphant, threw me out of the room. That's all he says. Now, actually, it's a much more interesting story. Lakshmi Das was Gandhi's elder brother. He was an intriguer who wanted to become Diwan of Porbandar, as his father had before him. And in order to fulfill his ambition, he had allied himself with the heir to the throne of Porbandar, who was the prince who was going to inherit his grandfather's throne. Now, the prince, like many others of his ilk, was a rather dissolute character. He had a large harem, and he recently acquired a new mistress, and he was a spendthrift. And he then decided to organize a theft in the palace of the jewels, the heirlooms of Porbandar, to sustain his profligate ways. And Lakshmi Das, namely Gandhi's brother, was an accomplice in all of this. Now, unfortunately, they were caught. And the police apprehended Lakshmi Das and the prince. And the Gandhi name was in disgrace. Gandhi merely tells you that my brother was in trouble. He doesn't tell you that his brother was involved in an unsuccessful operation to rob the palace of their home state of its jewels. So Gandhi goes to South Africa, partly because he's failed as a lawyer in Bombay, but partly because the family name is in disgrace in Porbandar. The name of Gandhi is in rather bad odor in Kathiawar. So he goes, a Muslim merchant, as you know, a Muslim merchant called Dada Abdullah calls him to settle a case that involves a dispute with his cousin. Now he goes there. He goes there to solve one case, but stays with interruptions more than 20 years. And he's first based in Natal, where a year after he goes, in October 1894, he starts the Natal Indian Congress. Note the name, modeled on the Indian National Congress, which had been started a decade previously. But the Natal Indian Congress is what it's called. It's to lobby for the rights of Indians in Natal, their rights to own property, their rights to travel across the region, even the right to vote, which Gandhi at first advocates. Now, South Africa at this time, 1894, was divided into 4 parts. 2 parts along the coast were controlled by the British. These were the provinces of the Cape and of Natal, where Gandhi was based. And 2 provinces in the hinterland were controlled by Dutch-speaking Afrikaners. This is Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Now, Gandhi, most of the Indians were in Natal. They had gone as indentured laborers to work on the sugar plantations. Later on, and these were largely Tamil and Telugu, some from the UP. Later on, Gujarati merchants came in to start stores for their Indian Tamil counterparts, and many of these Gujarati merchants became extremely prosperous. Dada Abdullah, who was the merchant who called Gandhi, owned 7 ships plying between Bombay and South Africa. He owned stores in Cape Town, in Durban, in the Transvaal, and also in Mozambique. So some of them were very, very rich. Now, the interesting thing about Gandhi's years in Natal is that most of his clients were Muslim. Now, in England, he had stayed with a Christian, Josiah Oldfield. In Durban, when he first went, he stayed in Dada Abdullah's home. Again, you have to transport yourself back to the 1890s. This was simply inconceivable in the Mumbai or the Rajkot or the Porbandar or the Madras or the Bangalore or the Ahmedabad of the 1890s, that a Hindu would stay in the home of Bania, extremely fastidious about his food, would stay in the home of a carnivorous Muslim. So he's already learning how to break the boundaries of his upbringing, how to make friends across religious barriers, racial barriers, caste barriers. So Gandhi is an activist in South Africa, in Natal, between 1894 and 1901, and then he returns. Now this is again a mystery which Gandhi doesn't tell you very much about. Why does Gandhi return? He's a successful lawyer in Natal. Well, he returns for 2 reasons. One, which is explicit, namely the education of his children. You know, in the school, there are no schools for Indians in Natal. And because Gandhi's children are brown, they're prohibited from the better schools, which are for Europeans only. But there's also the professional ambition. I think Gandhi, all through his life, till 1915, was an intensely ambitious man. He wanted to make a mark. And in 1901, one of his ambitions, and perhaps the principal reason, though unspoken and unstated in his autobiography, the principal reason why he returns to India is to try and establish himself at the Bombay Bar. So he comes and he fails again. He is here all through 1902, trying to establish himself in the Mumbai bar, and he gets nowhere. Partly because he was an indifferent speaker. You know, this is one of the things about Gandhi, was that he was not a good orator. Partly because of his peers who had graduated 15 years before, along with him, have already established themselves. So it's hard for him to break in into a closely, into a kind of a close social network. And in December 1902, he's invited back to South Africa. Now, there's a reason for this. In between, in 1899, while he was still in South Africa, the Afrikaners and the British go to war, what's called the Anglo-Boer War. And the war is partly about gold, because there's a gold boom in Johannesburg, which was controlled by the Afrikaners, but the English had the entrepreneurial instincts to mine that gold. And they wanted a greater share of political power in Johannesburg and Transvaal, which the Afrikaners did not give them. And there was a civil war, a bloody and brutal civil war, in which, incidentally, it was the first time concentration camps were used by the British to incarcerate Afrikaner prisoners of war. So while the war ends, there's a post-war settlement, and the South African Indians call Gandhi back, because in the post-war settlement, what will be the role of Indians? Now, already the Indians are in a kind of strange position in South Africa. They are betwixt and between the ruling whites and the subordinated Africans. Clearly the Africans are subordinated. They are third class, so to say, in that order of things, and the whites are ruling. There's a fight between the Afrikaners and the British, but then they reconcile after the war, and now they want to unite against the darker races. So the Indians are in between. They don't belong to the continent. They are migrants to South Africa, like the Afrikaners and the British, but without the rights that the white people enjoy. And Gandhi's activism is mostly about rights of property, travel, marriage. It's not about full-fledged citizenship rights. Gandhi thinks it premature in 1895, 1900, 1902. He recognizes that in the sharply stratified society of South Africa, Indians will never get full citizenship rights. So he's asking essentially for the right to own property, the right to trade. The whites are keen that the Indians be ghettoized so they don't compete with European traders. They say that Indians can't own property in the upmarket localities. They want to restrict the travel of Indians between provinces. They want to insist that all Indians are married by something that approximates Christian rights, even though most Indians are Hindus and Muslims, and indeed some Parsis. So Gandhi is called back to South Africa in 1902, once more after having failed at the Bombay Bar. And in this second period in South Africa, which runs from 1903 to 1914, he is based largely in Johannesburg, where the Indians are in the most precarious position following the end of the Boer War. And it's in Johannesburg that he organizes his first satyagrahas. Between 1907 and 1913, he organizes several major satyagrahas. Early on, he goes to jail 4 times. Early on, his closest allies are Gujarati Muslims. And it's with their help that he starts a journal called Indian Opinion. Again, the roots of this date back to his days with the vegetarians. He recognizes that if you want a campaign, you want to effectively campaign for your rights, you need a vehicle, a propaganda vehicle, which in the early 20th century had to be a newspaper. The radio hadn't been invented, there was no television, no internet, and so on. Had to be a newspaper. And the striking thing about Indian Opinion, and it tells you something about the evolution of Gandhi's thinking at the time, is that the Indian Opinion came out in 4 languages. Indeed, in 4 scripts. It was printed in English, Gujarati, Tamil, and Hindi. And it was almost certainly the first multilingual, maybe even the last multilingual paper in the world. I mean, I don't know of any other examples. Bilingual papers existed. I mean, Tilak's Maratha, which was published out of Pune, came in Marathi and English. In Bombay in the 1890s, you had what were called Anglo-Gujarati papers, partly English, partly Gujarati. But this was printed in 4 languages. And Gandhi wrote much of it. Sometimes under his own name, sometimes under, pseudonyms. Now, it's a long and complicated story, his life in South Africa, full of interest and, at least to a scholar like me, and I've written, as I said, I don't want to repeat too much of what I said in my book. But there are 2 elements of the personal story which I would like to briefly highlight, because they will help us understand what Gandhi was like when he landed, what his worldview was like, what his personality was like, what his political philosophy was like when he landed in Mumbai in January 1950. The first is that, as in England, uh, he furthers his ability to make friendships across the racial divide. In my book, I talk about his crucial European associates, who've been largely written out of the Gandhi literature. His friend Henry Pollack, Henry Pollack's wife Millie, who was an early feminist, and kind of persuaded Gandhi to be less patriarchal in his attitude towards women. And the Pollacks and the Gandhis, an English couple and an Indian couple, shared a home in Johannesburg in 1905. 1906. Again, an extraordinarily transgressive thing to do. We couldn't do it in Bombay, you couldn't do it in London, and Johannesburg in 1905 was the most racist city in the most racist country in the world. And you have this interracial couple. And Pollack was, a tireless worker for Gandhi's cause. He was the second in command. He toured through India raising money for Gandhi. He gave some famous speeches in Mumbai in 1909 about the struggle in South Africa. Raising money, he wrote pamphlets. Millie was, as I said, an early feminist who argued with Gandhi, who had many intense arguments with Gandhi. There was another feminist associate of Gandhi who's been forgotten, who was his secretary, Sonia Schlesing, who was also Jewish, like Pollack, and who interned with Gandhi, wanted to become the first woman lawyer in South Africa, just as Gandhi had been the first Indian lawyer. But the Bar Association would not grant her a license, even though she had passed the exams. So she suppressed her disappointment, worked with Gandhi, assisted in the struggle. When the Satyagrahis went to jail against racist laws, Sonia Schlesing on a bicycle would be taking food from one jail to another. I mean, it's actually a wonderful and moving story, the story of Gandhi's South African associates. Not all of them were white. Another very important figure who I believe has got much less attention than he deserves was a Tamil radical called Thambi Naidu, who, when the struggle was flagging, when the Gujarati merchants who had been to jail once did not want to go to jail twice and a third time, and funding was drying up, this Tamil called Thambi Naidu and his wife and his children mobilized the Tamils, both in Johannesburg and in the coal mines and sugar plantations of Natal, to join the struggle. And he was a real militant. He went to jail many times. His grandson was in jail with Nelson Mandela. His daughter-in-law, Amma Naidu, as she was known, was active in the earlier anti-apartheid struggles of the 1940s and 50s. Her son, Indresh Naidu, was in Robben Island with Nelson Mandela. And Thambi Naidu was really a very important influence on Gandhi. Now, people like Thambi Naidu, Henry and Millie Pollack, Sonia Schlesing, their significance in Gandhi's life is easily comparable to the significance of the well-known associates of his Indian years. They're as important to Gandhi, and hence to the history, arguably to the history of Satyagraha, if not the history of India, as Nehru, Patel, Azad, Rajendra Prasad, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, people who worked with Gandhi in the 1920s and 30s, about whom we know a great deal. But his South African associates, unfortunately, have been forgotten. Now, in his 2 decades of living in South Africa, struggling in South Africa, first in Natal and then in the Transvaal, Gandhi emerged as a religious pluralist, as someone who understood the vital importance not just of Hindu-Muslim harmony, but of establishing relations of understanding and dialogue between different religious traditions. He also emerged as a true Indian, recognizing the diversity of his homeland. I talked about a newspaper in 4 languages. And this is only because he was in the diaspora, where there were Tamils, there were Biharis, there were Telugu speakers, there were Gujaratis, there were Parsis. Now, so it's curious that had Gandhi succeeded as a lawyer in Mumbai, he would not have understood the diversity of India. I'm sure most of his clients would have been Gujaratis. Probably a majority would have been Banya. But it was while working in the diaspora that he understood not only the religious diversity, but the linguistic diversity of India. I mean, this is actually very important to the history of modern India. I mean, our currency note, and it has 17 scripts on it. And part of this is because when Gandhi comes back to India in 1915, And when in 1920 he takes charge of the Congress, he reorganizes the Congress committees according to linguistic zones. Now, till 1920, you had a Bombay Presidency Congress, a Bengal Presidency Congress, a Madras Presidency Congress. But in the Madras Presidency, there were Tamil speakers, Telugu speakers, Kannada speakers. In the Bombay Presidency, there were Urdu speakers, Gujarati speakers, Sindhi speakers, Marathi speakers. And he reorganizes the Congress according to linguistic lines. And it's because of his experience in South Africa. It's been while living in the diaspora that the true diversity of India, linguistic, religious, class diversity. I mean, that here he's working with Tamil indentured laborers. Had he been a lawyer in the Bombay High Court, he would not have worked with Tamil indentured laborers. It's also in South Africa that Gandhi becomes more sensitive to gender rights. I mean, his evolution still has a long way to go. I mean, he's still conservative and patriarchal when he returns, but by working with people like Millie Pollack, by having combative secretaries like Sonia Schlesien, by persuading his wife Kasturba to go to jail with him, Gandhi recognizes the significance of of a major public role for women in Indian society. It's in South Africa, of course, that Gandhi first thinks of and evolves the idea of satyagraha. It's in South Africa that he emerges as a person of rare physical courage. I mean, there are 2 assassination attempts on him, one of which is he's beaten to death and saved by a white couple in Durban in 1897. So, and yet there's another assassination attempt 10 years later in Johannesburg. So it's in South Africa that he, becomes fearless, willing to court death. It's also in South Africa that he recognizes the power of his personality, that people will follow him, that they're persuaded by his words, they're inspired by his courage. It's in South Africa that he learns how to run an organization, how to collect funds to run a political campaign. So, Gandhi was really shaped by South Africa. I mean, South Africans are fond of telling visiting Indians that you gave us a lawyer, we gave you a Mahatma. Now, this is it's a nice remark and largely accurate, because in a personal, philosophical and political sense, Gandhi was made by his years in the diaspora. In a personal, political and philosophical sense, Gandhi was made by his years in the diaspora. So, there was one exception. I'll come to that. There was one way in which South Africa did not prepare Gandhi. Put it off. There was one way in which South Africa did not prepare him for life in India, which I'll come to. But by and large, as the religious pluralist, as someone who recognized the diversity of India, as someone who would transgress class boundaries to count Tamil laborers as his friends, as a theorist and practitioner of satyagraha, in all these respects, Gandhi was fully formed when he landed in Apollo Bandar on January the 9th, 1915. So that was Gandhi in 1915. I'll now come to India in 1915. In 1915, India had been under direct colonial rule for less than 60 years. It's in 1858 that, after the mutiny, that the British Crown takes control over India. Now, 1857 is the year of the Great Rebellion, known to the British as the Sepoy Mutiny, known to some Indians as the First War of Indian Independence, to give it the name that Savarkar first gave it. Now, 1857 was also the year that our first universities were set up. And the popular rebellion of 1857 was backward looking. It wanted to set up Bahadur Shah Zafar as the king of India. But the universities unknowingly set into motion a revolution that was forward looking. This is not what the British anticipated. They started Bombay, Calcutta and Madras University to educate people in English who would then man the lower rungs of the colonial civil service. That was their intention. But unknowingly, they had set in motion a social revolution. The Indian universities were the first public places in India where men and women could go together to study or just to interact. They were the first public places in India where people of different castes could live in the same hostel. It took Oxford and Cambridge more than 600 years after their establishment to admit women. But Bombay University was doing it within 5 or 10 years of its establishment. So this is really an interesting historical paradox that the universities set up to provide officials for British rule allowed Indians not only to learn more about their society, but it gave them the language of liberty and freedom with which to challenge the rulers. I mean, you study politics in Bombay University in the 1880s to 1890s, you're reading Bentham and Mill and, who talk about, universal franchise, civic rights, the importance of overcoming your subjection. And it's the universities who train the first generation of nationalists who start the Indian National Congress in 1885. By the time Gandhi came back in 1915, the Congress had been in existence for 30 years. It had, it was mostly based in the cities, but it had a reasonably credible record of activism behind it. Between 1905 and 1907, there was what's called the Swadeshi movement, a popular movement involving the boycott and bonfire of foreign goods. And it had produced some very impressive leaders. Among the leaders it had produced were two remarkable residents of this city and two remarkable residents of Pune, Nauroji, Jinnah, Gokhale and Tilak, all of whom preceded Gandhi. I mean, Nauroji was of course much older. Gandhi had got to know him as a student in England and admired him. Gokhale Gandhi met in 1896 when he went to Pune for the first time and immediately adopted him as his mentor. Tilak was also someone he met and corresponded with. And Jinnah, who was 2 years younger than Gandhi, was by 1915 much better established than Gandhi. In this 100 years ago this week, there was a meeting of the Gujarati Sabha of Bombay to welcome Gandhi and Kasturba on their return from South Africa. And I was recently reading some newspaper accounts of that meeting. Now, again, Gandhi's autobiography is very interesting to see what he says and what happened. I mean, sometimes they overlap, sometimes, sometimes they negate one another, sometimes they actually complement one another. And this is one case in which they complement one another. Gandhi, in his autobiography, written in 1927, recalling the meeting in 1915, where the Gujarati Sabha of Bombay welcomed him, says, Mr. Jinnah was, this is what Gandhi writes in his autobiography, he says, Mr. Jinnah was the chief guest. He spoke in English and I spoke in Gujarati. So he's making a slight dig, he's making a slight crack at the expense of Jinnah. Right? He's a Gujarati, but he doesn't speak Gujarati. But that's part of the story. The newspaper report says that while Jinnah was the chief guest, the welcome, the formal opening of the meeting was done by a young, ambitious lawyer called K.M. Munshi, who will much later, of course, played an important and controversial role in India's history. But K.M. Munshi says, Gandhi, he does not call him Mahatma, Gandhi, who is returned from South Africa, is the greatest person ever produced by Gujarat. Now, in my view, Jinnah would not have taken that lightly. Because in 1915, Jinnah was much more important than Gandhi. I mean, Jinnah was a member of the Imperial Legislative Council. He was Gandhi had failed as a lawyer. He was a hugely successful lawyer. When Jinnah ascended the stage, when he came for the meeting of the Gujarati Sabha, to be the chief guest in welcoming Gandhi, Jinnah would have thought of himself as the most important Gujarati alive. But before he could make his own speech, here was a young interloper called K.M. Munshi saying that Gandhi is the greatest Gujarati who's ever been born. Now, so there were major leaders of the Congress. There was Tilak, there was Gokhale, there was Jinnah, there was Nauroji, there was Lajpat Rai in the Punjab, there was Bipin Chandra Pal in Bengal. Compared to all these leaders, Gandhi was untried on Indian soil. In 1915, the reputation he had was all based on his work in South Africa. He did not know India at all, which is why Gokhale told him to spend the first year traveling around India. Yet, there was K.M. Munshi was onto something. When he said Gandhi was the greatest Gujarati alive in 1915, that may have been an exaggeration. But there were several significant respects in which the Gandhi of 1915 differed from the Jinnah, the Gokhale, the Tilak of 1915. Firstly, unlike them, he had worked with laborers and petty merchants. He knew what it was to work with working class people. I mean, Jinnah, Nauroji, Gokhale all worked with middle class activists in the cities. You know, they worked with lawyers, doctors, teachers, civil servants. Gandhi had actually worked with the Indian poor in South Africa. Secondly, unlike Jinnah, Gokhale, Nauroji, he had worked with women. You know, when Kasturba went to jail in 1915, I mean, it was really revolutionary. In 1913, when she went to jail in South Africa, I mean, can you imagine? No woman had gone to jail in India. I mean, here were women who were in Parda. Slowly, some women were getting educated. But, you know, the thought that a woman, a married woman or an unmarried woman would go to jail, you know, would be under the supervision of some man who's from a different caste, the jailer. So he had worked with women, and not just in the struggle. I mean, he had personal friendships with women. I mean, Millie Pollack and Sonja Schlesien were actually intimate personal friends of his. I mean, and this is not something that was common among the Indians of that time. So unlike Jinnah and Nauroji and Gokhale, he had worked with laborers and petty merchants. He had worked with women. Unlike them, he really properly, intimately understood the religious and linguistic diversity of India. And unlike them, he had forged a new technique of political action, namely Satyagraha, which he was now determined to apply to India. Now, I talked about Gandhi's ambition. His ambition to succeed in the bar in Bombay. He also had an ambition to make an impact on Indian political life. He knew, I mean, this is again something that you have to read between the lines. He doesn't say so explicitly. He's not going to tell you in his autobiography that I was bored with working with 150,000 diasporic people in South Africa. I'd rather work with 300 million, you know, I'd rather have 300 million followers than 150,000. But essentially that is what it is. I mean, Gandhi had, so to say, run out of political and personal challenges in South Africa. Having organized several successful movements, he proved he could lead men and women, he could inspire them to go to jail. He had shown that he'd evolved a new technique of protest, collective, non-violent civil disobedience, the defiance of laws, not violence and not polite petitioning either. And he thought he was prepared to make a larger impact. Why did Gandhi come back to South Africa in 1915? Come back to India in 1915? Because he wanted a larger stage. I mean, every great political actor, like every great theatrical actor, wants a larger stage. And he was prepared. He was prepared in the ways I've talked about. Now, to show how prepared Gandhi was in 1915, I'm going to quote two letters. And these letters are intimately connected to Mani Bhavan, and are among the reasons I was so delighted and honored when the trustees of Mani Bhavan asked me to speak here this week. Mani Bhavan was the home of a Gujarati merchant called Reva Shankar Jagjeevan Jhaveri. He was a friend of Gandhi's. His son-in-law, Raichand Bhai, who was also a jeweler and a poet and a sage and a philosopher, was Gandhi's early mentor. Reva Shankar Jhaveri was not staying in this house when Gandhi meets Raichand Bhai in 1891. You know, Gandhi comes off the ship, is told by his brother Lakshmi Das that his mother has died, and then they go to the house of Reva Shankar Jagjeevan. I don't know where they were staying, but somewhere I think in north of this, where he meets Raichand Bhai. In 1970, the Reva Jagjeevan moves to this house. So he's a friend of Gandhi's, he's the father-in-law of Gandhi's spiritual mentor, and he is the elder brother of Gandhi's closest friend, a man called Pranjivan Mehta, whom I describe in my book as the Engels to Gandhi's Marx. Pranjivan Mehta was absolutely Gandhi's closest friend, closer than the Pollacks, closer than Sonja Schlesien, closer than, you know, Nehru, Patel, Azad, whatever. They meet in London in 1888. The first week that Gandhi goes to London, he has a letter of introduction to Pranjivan Mehta because he's also studying in London. Pranjivan is from Morvi, which is a princely state just a few dozen miles from Rajkot. So they have a kind of a connection. They meet, they become friends, and they stay in touch ever since. They have a very deep and intimate relationship. Pranjivan then goes to Rangoon, where he becomes a successful jeweler. And incidentally, he sets up the first political association in Rangoon, the Indian Political Association of 1908, and the Burmese set up their associations only later. So he's also an important political activist. And this is his family home. So his friends from Gandhi are all through. There's a wonderful book. I write quite a lot about Pranjivan in my own book, Gandhi Before India. But after that, there's been a first-rate biography of Pranjivan published by the veteran historian S.R. Mehrotra, which I urge all of you to read, which shows how deep and intimate the relationship was. Some of you would have read Gandhi's book Hind Swaraj, which was written on the ship back from London to South Africa in 1909. In 1909, Gandhi goes to London to lobby with the imperial government for the rights of Indians. He spends 4 months there. It's also that visit that he meets Savarkar for the first time and they have arguments about violence and non-violence. But on that visit, he has daily discussions with Pranjivan Mehta, who's also in England. And the result of these discussions is contained in the book Hind Swaraj, which is a dialogue between editor and reader. We all know that the editor was Gandhi, but the reader was really Pranjivan Mehta. Pranjivan Mehta is Gandhi's most consistent friend and financial patron. We know about the role played by Jamnalal Bajaj and G.D. Birla in sustaining Gandhi's activities in India. But Gandhi's activities in South Africa was sustained by Pranjivan Mehta. He was an extremely successful jeweler and large amounts of his money went to promoting his friend. The first biography of Gandhi, written by a dissident Baptist priest called Joseph Doak, was underwritten by Pranjivan Mehta. He funded the publication and also the distribution. He also brought out Gujarati and Tamil and Hindi editions. And the extent of his devotion to Gandhi was like Engels to Marx. That's why I called him the Engels to Gandhi's Marx. When Marx wrote his famous book, Das Kapital, he was obscure and unknown. Engels wrote 8 reviews of that book in 4 languages under 5 pseudonyms. And that was so in a sense, there's a parallel that like Engels, just as Engels was the first person to recognize the genius of Marx, Engels was also a prosperous merchant who funded Marx. And he did many things for Marx, well beyond what Pranjivan Mehta did for Gandhi. I mean, Engels also took on the paternity of an illegitimate child fathered by Marx, for example. But, the level of, but the parallel is this, that why I call Pranjivan Mehta the Engels to Gandhi's Marx is this. They were close, intimate friends. Pranjivan was the first to recognize Gandhi's genius, and I'll give you examples of that in a minute. And above all, just as Engels was the first to recognize Marx's genius, and above all, they shared a homeland and a mother tongue. The intimacy between Engels and Marx was partly because they were Germans in London. There were things that he could talk to Engels in his own language. And likewise with Pranjivan and Gandhi, they were both Kathiawaris and hence had this intimate personal connection as well. Now, to give you an indication of how prepared Gandhi was to transform India when he came in 1915, and also an indication of Pranjivan Mehta's devotion to Gandhi, I'm going to quote you 2 letters written by Pranjivan Mehta to Gokhale, who was a mentor of Gandhi. The first letter is dated 8 November 1909, and here is Pranjivan Mehta writing to Gokhale. I quote, "During my last trip to Europe, I saw a great deal of Mr. Gandhi. From year to year, I have known him intimately for over 20 years. I have found him getting more and more selfless. He is now leading almost an ascetic sort of life, not the life of an ordinary ascetic that we usually see, but that of a great Mahatma, and the one idea that engrosses his mind is his motherland." So in November 1909, Pranjivan Mehta is describing a modestly known lawyer in South Africa as a Mahatma. So this is the first time that anyone has called Gandhi a Mahatma, well before Tagore called him a Mahatma 10 years later. That's 1909. The second letter is even more interesting. It's also written by Pranjivan Mehta to Gokhale. It's written 3 years later, in August 1912, when Gokhale himself is preparing to visit South Africa to study the Indian situation at first hand. So here is Pranjivan Mehta to Gokhale on the eve of Gokhale's visit to South Africa. "So, you will soon have an opportunity of meeting and discussing things with Gandhi. From what little conversation we have had about him, that is Pranjivan and Gokhale have had about him, I was led to believe that you have not studied Gandhi well. In my humble opinion, men like him are born on very rare occasions and then in India alone. This is 1912. As far as I can see, it seems to me that India has not produced an equally far-seeing prophet like him during the last 5 or 6 centuries. India has not produced a prophet like him for the last 5 or 6 centuries. Then he continues, if Gandhi was born in the 18th century, India would have been a far different land from what it is now, and its history would have been altogether differently written. I shall be anxiously waiting to hear from you that your present view of his capacity has altered considerably since coming in greater personal contact with him, and that you will then see in him one of those rare men who are occasionally born to elevate humanity in the land of their birth. Now, this is an extraordinary and precocious anticipation of Gandhi's greatness. What is Pranjivan Mehta saying? He is saying he is like Kabir or Nanak, one of these people born of the Buddha. And if he had born in the 18th century, India would not have been colonized by the British. Essentially, it would have been a different country. That's what he's saying. Now, he's also saying this to Gokhale. Now, I would have loved to see Gokhale's face while he's reading this. I've already told you that Jinnah would have been puzzled by Gandhi being described as the greatest Gujarati alive in 1915. But Gokhale thought of himself as Gandhi's mentor. Gokhale thought of Gandhi as a protege. Gokhale was a member of the Imperial Legislative Council, was famous all over Europe, was hugely acclaimed all across India. And here is Pranjivan Mehta telling him that his disciple is far greater than him. You may be born once in a generation, but he is born once in 500 years. So that's a correction to Mani Bhavan. It's a sometime resident of Mani Bhavan, a member of the family that owned Mani Bhavan, that had this extraordinary anticipation of Gandhi's greatness. Now, I did say that Gandhi was largely prepared for the role he was to assume in India, which I'm not going to talk about. I mean, I'm now more or less done, because that's another story and largely well known. He was unprepared in one respect. In South Africa, he understood religious diversity. He understood the importance of reaching beyond a middle-class audience to work with working-class people. He had begun slowly to shed his patriarchal prejudices. He had theorized and tested this unique weapon of satyagraha. All that he had done. But he was largely unprepared in one respect, and that was that of untouchability. He only vaguely knew the nature of untouchability, the pernicious social practice prevalent all across India. In the diaspora, it was present, but not very much. And again, it was a South African, again largely forgotten, a South African Indian who educated Gandhi about untouchability. He was a Tamil called J.M. Lazarus, who had been born in an untouchable family in South India, and had converted to Christianity to try and escape caste discrimination. And when Gandhi comes back to India in 1915, J.M. Lazarus writes him a series of letters saying the Congress is dominated by Brahmins and Baniyas. And please make sure that it takes the question of untouchability seriously, because otherwise, when independence comes, the untouchables won't be. So, in a sense, that's one thing he learns while traveling across India between 1915 and 1920, when in 1920 at the Nagpur Congress, Gandhi says, it's only when we abolish untouchability that we'll be prepared for Swaraj. So this learning takes place in India. With other respects, he's prepared. Bombay or Mumbai is, of course, very important in Gandhi's life, later life. It's where he organizes his first major satyagraha, the Rowlatt Act, against the Rowlatt Act in the summer of 1919. It's where the spectacular bonfires of foreign cloth are held in 1920-21. It's where he organizes and starts his last great campaign against British rule, the Quit India movement. So Bombay is crucial for Gandhi. And that's the part of the story that I will talk about in my second volume. But Bombay is crucial for Gandhi in another way, a less appreciated way, and historically perhaps more foundational way. And I'm going to end with that, this statement of why Bombay is important to Gandhi. If on either of his two attempts, first in 1892 and second in 1902, if on either of his two attempts, Gandhi had succeeded at the Bombay bar, we would not be meeting today. So every time I pass the great Gothic building that is the Bombay High Court, I issue a silent thank you to that building for making Gandhi a serial failure at the Bombay bar. Thank you very much.